I'm going to tell you a story or two today about my intuition and how I learned to follow it and hear it. It's sort of a long rambly story, and so I'm going to try really hard to stay focused, and this is the third attempt I've taken at starting it. We might have to go to 5. I have no idea. It's kind of an emotional story for me as well, so I ask for your patience. So, for me, intuition is a gut sense, knowing in my head, really, and maybe even my heart, of which direction to head in. When I was younger and I was in the synagogue, I would go to temple and I would sit in the pew and I would be a part of the service and I would sing in Hebrew and then words I did not know what they meant. And I was looking for more. I was looking for that feeling. And when I was 15, I met a girl named Carolyn, who I call Sunny. And she introduced me to Christianity. And I got that feeling I was looking for. What I later learned was spirit. I went off to college and I bumped into a bunch of people, what I would classify as charismatic Christian. And they clearly felt something. They felt more than I did. And I wanted to feel. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to be a Bible major. This is a whole other story in itself. But my dad told me that unless I got a degree where I could support myself, so when my husband left me, I would be able to, get a job and be able to run my house and not have to worry about it. I needed a job where I could support myself for when my husband left me. And so I wasn't allowed to be a Bible major with a youth min minor. I had to go into something that was profitable. So I became an English major and a middle school and secondary education minors. Well, middle school education major. I was a double major in middle school education and English, and I was a secondary education minor. Somewhere in there, I went to Northern California and met, well, I don't think I introduced you to Camy. Camy was one of my best friends in college. I met her when I was a freshman and a prospective student, and I stayed in her room. And then sometime towards the end of my freshman year, I bumped into her on campus. Well, she bumped into me. She walked past my dorm window, and I was like, "Hey, it's you!" And she was like, "Hey, it's you!" And so I went over for dinner. I think it was pancakes. And she hasn't gotten rid of me since. So I went with her to Northern California and I stayed in her house, and her mom introduced me to the Holy Spirit, and she talked to me about God in a way that I hadn't really talked about God before, in a very personal. I was in a class called Christian Doctrine where the professor, Dr. Green, who reminded me all the world of Rowan Atkinson. So here he is talking about Christian philosophy, and all I can think of is Mr. Bean officiating a wedding and 4 weddings and a funeral, and I would break out into hysterics every time he talked about the Holy Spirit, because in 4 weddings and a funeral, Rowan Atkinson does this whole shtick about the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spigot, and oh man, in my early morning Christian doctrine slash Bible 101, 102, because it was the New Testament class, I just got the fit of giggles every time he said it, because all I could think of was a Rowan Atkinson, because he looked just like him. And he would say, Rowan Atkinson, aka Dr. Green would say, God doesn't care about whether or not you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch or you have a tuna fish. He would say that. He'd be like, God doesn't care. And when I met up with Camy's mom was like, God definitely cares. God definitely cares about whether or not you're having a tuna fish sandwich versus a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He wants to be in the minutia of your everyday. And I really liked a God that was so present. It really made me happy. Content, satisfied, overwhelmingly peaceful. And she gave me a book to read, and I read it, and I had an experience that one would call meeting the Holy Spirit, where I just sort of wanted to just lie there and roll around in the good feelings of it. And she talked to me about speaking in tongues. And I certainly couldn't do it on that trip. Because you have to turn off your brain to speak in tongues. You have to allow spirit to come up out of your body and just roll into it. That's not so easy for me and my brain. I overthink. And I think very hard. And so whenever I would start to feel like I was going to talk, I would it up. I would choke. And I would think, what am I going to say? I'm so excited. And then it would cut off the flow. And I know now, after watching a lot of Esther and Jerry Hicks and Abraham, that what I was doing is I would start to float downstream. And then I would realize that I would get into the flow and I would and then I would flip over very fast and start swimming upstream because I was like, I want to know what that is. I want to know what that means. I want to know. And it was around this time, 23, 24, that I dated this guy who, we would be divorced. We would be divorced 7 times over if I had actually married the man. But I fully believe we were supposed to be together, and I fully believe that he was it. And part of the reason I believe that is because I heard it repeatedly. I repeatedly heard, you're going to marry, and then his name. I'm going to call him Quentin right now. There's not a Quentin in my life in any way, shape, or form, ever. There was never even a student named Quentin. So we'll just go with Quentin, right? You're gonna marry Quentin. And I'd be like, okay. And as I was learning to hear from Spirit, I would be driving along the highway and they'd be like, turn right here. And I'd turn right and then I'd turn left and I'd turn left. And then I would show up in a place and Quentin would be there. Or I would be going down the highway and they're like, if you go to Barnes and Noble right now, you'll bump into Quentin. And I would go to Barnes & Noble right then, and I would bump into Quentin. But then there were times that I would say, turn right, turn left, turn right, turn left, and I would do all of it, and then I would wind up lost. Or I would say, go to Barnes & Noble, he's there right now, and I'd go, and he wasn't. And I don't really see Quentin as the end game in this story. I see trying to learn Spirit and Spirit's guidance as the end game of this story. Maybe I was supposed to be in Barnes & Noble at that time. Maybe it was to give Quentin time to go find somebody else. So I came to the realization at some point that I didn't actually want to be with Quentin. I had no desire to be with Quentin. I didn't even like Quentin. He, as an individual, was a jerk. I have stronger words inside my head for him. He was not okay. And he was friggin' studying to be a pastor, and he was a hot friggin' mess. There was nothing about his character. Anyway, I'm stopping there. So when I realized I didn't really actually want anything that the Spirit was offering me, or the things I had learned, and then I kept saying I heard wrong. I kept saying I heard wrong. I heard wrong. And because I, quote, heard wrong, I didn't want to hear it all. I'd rather be deaf to Spirit than hear correctly. And at this point, I could speak in tongues. And at this point, I had been able to get over my inability to speak in tongues, and I could do it. And so I decided I was done hearing from Spirit because it was messy and it was sloppy and I didn't hear properly. I got it wrong, and I felt, and let's be honest, I still feel that I have to hear correctly. And I want to rephrase that. If you know Game of Thrones, there's a character in there named Melisandre who has flaming red hair, and she's in love with a man who's rivaling to be king. And what she later realizes that she saw the signs properly. She just misinterpreted them. And that's sort of the deal, right? You see all the signs properly, but you misinterpret them. And that's what happened with Quentin, I think. I wasn't wrong. I just wasn't hearing wrong. Maybe I had attached other meanings that weren't supposed to be there to what I was hearing. Maybe in a moment we were in one form of reality supposed to be together. If he had turned left and I had turned right and we were able to meet in the middle. But I was too left and he was too right. Oof, would have been nasty. So, in my desire to never be wrong again, I threw baby bathwater container that holds all of it right out my bedroom window in a big splashy blooshy mess and said, I don't want to hear from Spirit. I'm done. I'm done hearing from Spirit. Fast forward 3 or 4 years. I moved into an apartment down in Nottingham, Pennsylvania, off a 1/4-mile driveway. I love that apartment. I love those landlords. She was a Christian. I was farming at the time. If any of you watched the Instagram reels about that, I just started telling farming stories on Instagram reels. Whew. I was farming at the time. And I moved into this little apartment above a garage that there was an unfinished base, like an unfinished garage, and the apartment would freeze in the winter and be a little hot in the summer. But I loved it. It had eaved ceilings that it would bonk my head into the kitchen all the time. And the driveway, like I said, was a 1/4 mile. It was down in the middle of it attached to the Her potato chip barren lands, and it was beautiful space. It was so country. It was in the woods, literally. I loved it. I was lost when I moved in there, and the landlord's wife was, well, she's also my landlord, delightful and wonderful, and kind of helped rescue me a little bit. And so I moved in, and they introduced me to their good friend whose sons went to a vineyard church in the corners of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And I went, and I stayed. And I called that church home for a number of years. And there was a man in that church who the pastor called Big Dog. Big Dog looked at me one day. His name was Steve. And he said, the Spirit is on you, and you can hear it. And I was like, oh no, we're not going down this road. And he's like, and I'm going to teach you how to trust it. So I started walking in Spirit. And he would bring me up front after service. I went through the trainings with him, and he would bring me up front when it was time and he felt I was ready. He would bring me up front, have him stand next to me, and I was a member of the prophetic team. And I would put my hand on somebody's arm and I would, quote, give them a word. I would see pictures. I would hear things. I would tell them things. I one time got called into the pastor's office because I told somebody that they were moving back to their country of origin and that their relationship with their mother was going to be healed. And the pastor called me in and said, you have to stop telling people things they don't want to hear. And I was like, okay. And then that person moved back to their country of origin. And then that pastor came to me one Sunday and asked for a word. And when I told him what the word was, what I saw him unwrapping a brand new soccer ball and playing with it, and that it was a really good gift. And he was encouraged. And it came to be exactly what he needed to hear to help him get through a really challenging moment. It was the exact word he told me later. It was exactly what he needed. And he looked at me and he said, I know exactly what that means. And it is extremely helpful. Thank you. And his interpretation of it was up to him. I'm like, I'm not getting an interpretation. All I see is you have a brand new soccer ball and you're playing with it. That's all I'm seeing. And he's like, that's all I need. So if a pastor who calls me in because I got in trouble then comes to me for a word that was like really reassuring and really affirming. I got in trouble a little bit at the church because, let's be honest, I was too liberal. I'm not very good at being a fundamentalist, and I'm not very good at being a quiet Christian wife, which is one of the reasons I never married. I had crushes on guys in the church. Oh, did I have crushes? Whew. And I would always ask Steve, what do you know about that? And he'd be like, I don't know, I'm not getting anything. I don't know, I'm not getting anything. Well, tell me if the answer is no. And he's like, I'm not getting anything. We had rules about what you could and couldn't say about what. Relationships was one of those things. He was always very clear when the answer was a no, though. And then I got sick. I got really sick. And I was the one who found the lump. And I was the one who went to the doctor. Erin, I was on the phone with one of my other really good friends from like teaching, my first year teaching, and she was like, you're going to the doctor. So I went to the doctor. And I was staying at Steve and Linda's house the night I found out that they thought it was cancer. And then we said that I wanted to do everything at the University of Pennsylvania at a family member's suggestion. And then I got a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer. And I had people on the prophetic team tell me that this wasn't going to be anything, that I would be miraculously healed, that I wouldn't have to do chemo. And I held on to that. The head pastor came up to me and he said that he saw a word written down my back. And this was before I was actually officially diagnosed. He said he saw the word lymphoma written down the back. And that as I was sitting there in prayer, it broke off and hit the ground. He said it was, later on he told me, he said, I see it being a speed bump. He's like, it's the kind of speed bump that you hit and it bottoms out your car. And you wonder if you lost your muffler. He goes, but you'll still have a car and you're going to be okay. And so, gosh, this story is really hard to tell. I'm sorry for the long pauses, but gosh, every time I like get this huge knot in my throat and my eyes water. This is such a hard story to tell. And if you're watching this on video, I have a pouty face. I don't mean to be pouty. I'm just trying so hard not to like lose my poop. Okay. So, I had to do chemo. And like a petulant 3-year-old, I was living in my mom's house. And I lived in my mom's house for treatment, and then I went back to Steve and Linda, his wife. I went back to their house for like a year and a half. They graciously took me in for like a year and a half while I recovered from chemo and while I recovered from being sick. And I was still teaching and I was exhausted and I started taking classes. And then I enrolled and I moved back into my mom's house when I decided to get my master's in social work. And I went back to school. And it took me a year and a half after cancer ended in November of 2020. Yep, November of 2020. Cancer was like over. I was out of treatment at that point, and I was back teaching in November 1st of 2020. I found the lump April 1st of 2020. November 1st of 2020, I was back in teaching, and the cancer story was, quote, over. So I was still in the church for about a year and a half after being sick. And then I went to graduate school. And a friend of mine in graduate school basically said, you're not going to be a Christian by the time this is over. I said, no, I am. And she said, no, you're really not. And by the time graduate school was over, I had seen too much. I had been through too much. I was no longer the person I was, and I couldn't go back there, and I wanted nothing to do with Jesus. The Holy Spirit and I, yes, absolutely give me more of that. But I felt like if you're not in the Godhead, you have no right being intuitive for somebody else. You have no right walking in spirit if you're not in the Godhead. And so I stopped listening to my intuition again because I wanted nothing to do with a God who told me I had to work out my faith in fear and trembling. Ironically, one of the guys that had a crush on, like the biggest crush ever on this guy. Oh, and he was in seminary actually at the time when we were talking after I was done being sick. He basically said to me, I said don't tell me anything. Don't you can't convert me back. I said, because I already know everything. I read the Bible 3 times. I know it. I know it well. So go ahead, use all your like stuff that people always say. You're gonna have to be really creative if you're gonna get me back. And he said, well, what are your sticking points? And I said, work out your faith with fear and trembling. And he goes, that doesn't mean what you think it means. In the Greek, it means something else. And I said, yeah, go look it up and tell me what you think it means. Tell me if it means actual, literal fear. You want a God who wants you afraid of him. Him, please not the him. A God who wants you afraid of him. And he came back and he said, yeah, that fear is actually the fear you're talking about. And I said, I want nothing to do with a God that inspires fear. I said, because I have had enough fear in this lifetime. Chemo is terrifying. Death is terrifying. I've had enough fear in this lifetime. I don't need a God to be terrifying too. I said, no, thank you. That might be actually the last time he and I have ever spoken. No, there might have been another time, actually. I had a word for him. He wanted to know where it came from. What spirit does this come from? Spirit. It comes from spirit. Because my friend Erin, who I mentioned earlier, who told me to go to the doctor when I found the lump, she always said all spirit is spirit. So when I would lay hands on her, she would take it because all spirit was spirit. I now understand what that means. So I got sick. I went through graduate school. I got sick. I got better. And then I went through graduate school and I walked away from faith. I then found meditation as being a source of calming because I had an anxiety disorder. I had an anxiety disorder before getting sick. And then I got it somewhat under control, wasn't on anti-anxiety medication. However, I still had the occasional panic attack. And then I got sick, and then I really started having panic attacks. And my mom was like, we call it post-cancer traumatic disorder. And my oncologist was like, yeah, that's not wrong. You're not wrong there. And so I realized meditation, sitting and just being for 10 minutes, made me feel so much better. I learned that in my classes for graduate school, that I knew that I wanted to study mindfulness and become a qualified mindfulness instructor once I got out of graduate school. And so I took the preliminary classes, and I dragged my dad to the 8-week mindfulness course that John Kabat-Zinn wrote up in Massachusetts, but they deliver them at universities around the nation. And so the University of Pennsylvania was offering it with Michael Boehm, and I took it with somebody else, a woman named Biddy, in the evenings. And it turns out, as I work in the hospital that I'm in now, a number of people who work in the hospital with me are also were also in that class with me and my dad. And my dad told me later that he probably would have dropped out of the class if I hadn't been like making him go every week. And we met for dinner every week before we went to class, before we went to go and sit. Literally went and sit in meditation in class for meditation, although they called it mindfulness. And then I studied mindfulness. I took a second 8-week class. And in the second 8-week class, the instructor was talking about being at a silent retreat. And I was like, I want to do one of those. So in October of 2017, I signed up for a silent retreat a 7-day silent retreat as my first silent retreat. It was at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. And it was led by Saki Santarelli, who was John Kabat-Zinn's first intern, Florence Mayo Meyer, who still works teaching, instructing, and Bob Stahl. Both of them work on instructing mindfulness, MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction practitioners. So I was in this silent retreat, and I was terrified of getting a cold or the flu and being bedbound for 4 days and missing out on everything that was happening. And the fear was overwhelming. And on a Wednesday of the silent retreat, I was in the bathroom and I was like, why am I so scared of being sick? Like, why am I so scared of getting sick? Like, being sick is not that big a deal. Like, it's just, I'll be in bed or I'll be sick. It's not that big. And then I realized I wasn't scared of being little sick. I was scared of getting big sick. Like, I was scared of getting cancer sick. And I actually had a breakdown in the shower, and I washed that off. Literally, I just washed it off. And occasionally it rears its head still, but I see it now when it comes up, and I'm like, oh, there's that fear of getting sick again. Like, and I'm able to label it and notice it, and it doesn't grow like a big giant furnace in the basement that becomes a terrible monster, right? Jacob, the big tower, what's it? While I was on the silent retreat, because you're just there with your thoughts, I realized I missed walking in intuition. That there is a part of me that really likes being able to hear information from spirit, however you define that, for people who need guidance and help finding their way. I get lit up by that. It's fascinating to me. And so I bought a tarot deck, and I started to try to figure out how to read tarot cards. And then I went into a certified tarot class, and I figured it out. I started listening to spirit, and I realized that I didn't necessarily need the deck to hear, because I had been listening to spirit since, 2001, 2002. I've been listening to spirit, just in different ways. And so the tarot deck, I was like, I could read them immediately. I was like, once I knew what all the cards meant, I was like, yeah, I can do this. This is no problem. I can see everything in there now. Because I've been walking in spirit since 2001. And then recently I bumped into this book called Awe, which is Automatic Writing Experience by this Michael, I forget it, Sandler, I think is his last name. And I realized, pardon me, I've been automatic writing since 2007, 2008, when I took a John Paul Jackson prophetic course, and he taught us how to prophetically write. And again, I would pick up on stuff that wouldn't happen, and I would think I would see hearing wrong instead of like energy shifts, or that's how it felt in the moment, but then it was no longer that way. Energy shifts happen, right? And there were times where, even in the years that followed, that I would put down the automatic writing because I thought I was hearing wrong, because it didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way I expected, and therefore I must be mistaken. At one point I interviewed, this is like 2019, April of 2019, May of 2019, I applied for a job I really, really wanted at a boarding school in about an hour away from my house. I really, really wanted this job. I would be living on campus, or I'd be like living really close to campus, and I would be a therapist to the kids on campus. I really, really, really wanted this job. And a friend of mine was like, ask spirit for a sign, which is something you hear in the woo-woo world regularly. Ask for the sign that you're looking for. And I was like, And so I asked for a snail and a caterpillar in June of that year. I got the interview. I was lit up. It was the best freaking job. And I got the caterpillar, and then I started growing tomatoes, and I got snails too. Underneath my tomato, underneath my, I would take the hose out to water my tomato plants, and there would be snails underneath my tomato plant. I'd be like, I have caterpillars and I have snails. Spirit is definitely doing this. Well, I didn't go to work in a school until last year. I didn't get that job. But I have to tell you, if I had gotten that job, my dad got really sick in August of 2019, and he passed. I like to say he left because he's not gone. I still talk to him. I still feel him. I still know he's around. Like he's just not on this plane. He's on that plane, right? So I say my dad left in November of 2019. And if I had gotten the job, I would not have been able to be focused on his health the way that I was able to be focused on his health. And I was on the phone with his doctors all the time. So hearing for me is loaded and hard at times. But I'm trusting what I'm getting now a lot more than I ever did. I'm believing in the sensing a lot more. I started studying. There's a psychic in the area who was giving classes, and I started going to those classes, but then she stopped. Then the pandemic happened, and they weren't happening so much. And I during the pandemic, I started falling into like an hour of meditation a day, and then 2 hours on the weekends because there was nothing happening. And that deep entrance into meditation was powerful. And then a couple of months ago, I was in Abu Dhabi. And while I was in a bathroom in Abu Dhabi, I was like, you know what I need? I need a class that can help me teach intuition to other people. And that day, the same day I had the thought, I was visiting my friend Camy, who I mentioned earlier, where I went to Northern California, and her mom taught me about spirit. Camy's looking at her phone, and she goes, Heather, who's the woman Heather Alice Shea, is the woman who Camy is taking a how to be a intuitive life coach classes with. She goes, Heather Alice Shea is going to be teaching a how to teach intuition class. And I was like, I'm signing up for that. I need that. So I did. I signed up for how to hear your intuition. And I have to say, the class has deepened what I already have. I've also gotten really deep into automatic writing. May 1st, I started, and I've already filled a 2-inch binder filled with papers that I've scrawled out in automatic writing. I tap into my highest self, the highest version of me, and I ask questions, and then I get answers. And I let it flow, and I haven't really reread it. I just feel like allowing that flow. I do it in the morning and the evening. I feel like allowing that flow allows me to tap in even better during the day. People are able to ask me questions, and I am able to make miracles. I don't know how else to explain it. But there are often cases at the hospital where people are like, well, we've been working on this for a while. And then I walk in and I'm like, well, let's see what I can do. And I poke at it, and it like all the tangles just sort of fall out and it falls into place. And that's not me. It's because I'm walking in intuition, and I'm in the energetic field that allows for the answers to come in. We're all energy. Everything has energy. You just have to know how to tap into it. And so intuition for me is actually more, it's auditory a lot of the time. It'll tell me things. But sometimes it's visual, where I get images. And I have to be willing to trust it. If I push it away, it's not going to keep coming because it's not going to waste its time. So when I would get petulant and be the 3-year-old child that was miserable, and, I'm not listening to you, I'm not listening to you, then it would be like, fine, we're not going to talk to you. Or it might still talk to me, but I was too busy ignoring it. But it's like a slow rain and waits for the welcome. It's a gentleman. And so intuition for me is a getting quiet, a listening, a being willing to interpret wrong. I can be like, well, this is what I'm hearing. This is the words I'm hearing, because that's sometimes what happens. And I know people are like, well, that makes you certifiable and you're able to be committed. It's different. They're not evil. They're not telling me to hurt anybody. Like there's a difference. Or sometimes I'll get an image that pops through my head, or I'll get a memory of something. And when that happens, I just like listen to it. But because I'm a writer, sometimes when I'm writing, it's like I'm watching a movie inside my head that I'm putting down on paper for people to read. That's when I'm writing fiction. When I'm writing nonfiction, I hear the words. Sometimes I see the images of like what happened, but then I hear the words of what to type. And it's sort of like that. And it's a trust and it's a learning process. And I don't get it right. Like if you give me the coordinates to a specific location, I am not so good at that. That is not my gift. You ask me what the outcome of two different decisions are, I can probably see that. You ask me for a road out of a mess you're in, I can sometimes see that too. Like what the first step on the path would be. But if I press into it too hard and I try too hard, it's like when I would start speaking in tongues and I'd get so excited, and then I would like stop it from coming through. When I press into it too hard for an answer, it doesn't give me one. And if I'm too close to it, too emotional, and I really want something, I really want it, that's when I like have to rely on tarot cards to hear. Otherwise, I don't hear spirit. Or I ask a friend. My pastor's wife used to say that she gets by with a little help from her friends. That was like her life motto. I get by with a little help from my friends. And it's really true. I can't walk this intuitive life without having somebody else to bounce my intuition and my intuitive hits off of, because I have learned that I am flawed in my interpretations. And so I will reach out to people and be like, hey, I just heard this. Is this completely out of line? And they'll be like, yeah, you're too soon. Or, no, that's actually really accurate. And then we watch and see what happens. And sometimes it comes around and sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't mean I'm wrong. And that's hard for me to accept, because I often think that if I don't see the proof, then I must be hearing it all wrong. And there it is. I think that's everything I want to say today about intuition and how intuition works for me.